Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, and welcome to this webinar co-hosted by the International Association of Universities and the Center for International Higher Education at Boston College on the topic of ill-defined concepts, the case of responsible internationalization. It really is my pleasure to welcome all of you to this session. I am Gerardo Blanco, and I serve as the academic director for the Center for International Higher Education, and I will be mostly focusing today on the logistics of our call. We want to have a rich and very engaging session, and for that, we need everybody's help. What we ask of all of our colleagues attending this call is that you please keep both your cameras and microphones closed. That will enable us to focus all of our attention on our panelists. We have a wonderful panel joining us today, and we're really excited to really tackle this very significant topic of great interest for all of us. We also invite you to be very active during this session. So the fact that we're keeping microphones and cameras closed does not mean that we don't have an active role to play. We invite you to use the chat, as many of you are doing right now, to say hello, to share where you're located, and we will let that happen for several minutes in the beginning of this webinar. But after a few minutes of saying hello to everybody, what we invite you to use the chat for will be to pose your questions. We will be monitoring the chat actively and trying to group the different questions thematically, so don't hesitate to write your questions as you think about them, as they come up. So certainly, you're welcome to use the chat. We will try to pose as many of these questions to our panel as we can, and we really look forward to your very active participation in that sense. There will be two parts primarily to this webinar. I will be turning over to the first part. So the first part will be welcome remarks from representing both of the organizations co-hosting this activity. I will first turn it over to my dear friend and colleague, Hilligje van Land, Secretary General of the International Association of Universities. And then we'll turn it over to Hans de Wit, who is also my dear friend and colleague, but also a predecessor, having been director of the Center for International Higher Education, and now a distinguished fellow with us and co-editor of our flagship publication. So they will provide an overall set of remarks, and after that, I will turn it over to my dear colleague and friend, Giorgio Marinoni, also from the International Association of Universities, who will then moderate the panel and introduce our panelists. So as you can see, we have a very rich and very full agenda. So I will first now turn it over to Hilligje. Thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to a very active session with all of you. So, Hilligje.
Thank you so much, Gerardo, and very pleased to be here today and to co-organize this first CIHE IAU webinar in 2025 together again. This is not the first time that we have the opportunity and pleasure to co-host a webinar. This is already the 8th edition of a joint webinar since we started in 2020. This webinar here will be made available on the website of the CIHE, but for the IAU, it forms part of the IAU webinar series on the futures of higher education, which we started back in 2020. And what is interesting, I looked through the whole list of all the almost 75 webinars that we've hosted since then, and the 8 co-hosted with the CIHE. And in looking in the topics that we've dealt with when co-hosting with the CIHE, is that there is a recurrent theme that we actually can see over time. So there was initially, the first one we co-organized was on the future of higher education. Another one was on the future of international collaboration and academic partnerships already in November 2020. In 21, we focused on open science in a closed world, something that's connected to the topic of the day. In 22, we co-hosted again a webinar with the topic International Research Cooperation in a Changing Geopolitical Context. So why do I recall those is that it's because actually these webinars are made available on our websites and could be very interesting source of inspiration for all those who wish to see how this landscape is evolving. So if I understand correct, Gerardo, I can now also dig a little bit deeper into the concept and why it is an interesting concept for our discussion here today. So I have some 7 minutes, and bear with me or cut me off if I'm a bit too long. But I'm really thrilled that we have this webinar here today on the topic of responsible internationalization, which is a natural follow-up on these other 4 webinars that we've had together with CIHE, really exploring where internationalization nowadays is heading. So the title for my little intervention is Responsible Internationalization. Are we talking about cooperation, or are we talking about competition? And that's what the speakers will also dig deeper into. Internationalization in higher education indeed has many faces. It raises complex questions about how universities can engage with the world, balance their commitments to academic freedom and research integrity, and contribute to sustainable global development. In this webinar in particular, we will have a unique opportunity to explore with experts from different continents and backgrounds how universities navigate this delicate balance between cooperation and competition, particularly in this framework of what is now called responsible internationalization. I'm not an expert, the speakers are, yet I looked into it to really look also how the work of the IAU positions itself in regard of this broad topic. Let me begin by referencing the International Association of Universities' vision and mission, which states that universities have a responsibility to engage with and to respond to global challenges. We stress how much academic freedom and institutional autonomy are hallmarks of any university and a precondition for fulfilling their responsibilities. These principles resonate with many other organizations, and in particular also find their way into the Magna Carta Observatum. Patrick Deem, the principal of Queen's University, the president of the Magna Carta Observatory, and the vice president of the IAU, emphasizes there the human development as a central piece to the mission of higher education, where universities are to equip individuals with the capacity to address global challenges, contribute to building just, equitable, and sustainable communities. Higher education in this sense is a powerful force for both personal development and social progress. Yet we will see in this webinar that this whole cooperative aspect of higher education and internationalization is challenged more and more over time. Many of the global challenges we face, such as pandemics or climate change, to name those that are form part of much of the attention nowadays, cannot be solved by a single nation. Global cooperation is absolutely critical. And the EU Horizon Europe, for instance, that program exemplifies this by fostering research collaboration aimed at solving shared societal issues. Similarly, the whole framework of responsible research and innovation encourages ethical research practices that take into account environmental, societal impacts, aiming for inclusivity and sustainability in research. Yet there is around the world a growing concern for what is called research security, which contradicts this to some extent. Indeed, as international collaboration grows, so do concerns about foreign interference and research security. And geopolitical rivalries intensify, particularly in emerging fields such as artificial intelligence, quantum physics, quantum computing, or biotech, to name but a few. And the competition for technological dominance instead of cooperation, coupled with concerns about dual-use research and the need to protect intellectual property, increasingly shapes the landscape of international research collaboration. We see this, for instance, again, very strongly expressed in the European Union, where the European Economic Security Strategy emphasizes the importance of safeguarding research in areas which, with a reaffirmation and potential stressing of the dangers of dual-use applications such as military technology. And the EU calls for stricter monitoring of investments in international research and collaboration to ensure security, while also fostering partnerships based on shared values, academic freedom, and research integrity. This raises the important questions for the future. If a cooperative ethos fades away, if competition plays a stronger role in technological advancements and securing national interests, how then can we balance cooperation with competition? In the world of research and innovation, cooperation remains essential for addressing the global goals, but can we achieve that? So this tension between cooperation and competition is to be seen also in the European Union's approach to responsible internationalization, where it is matched with the phrase as open as possible, as restricted as necessary. So there is the idea of openness in scientific exchange, yet encouraging cooperation, while at the same time safeguarding against foreign interference and the theft of intellectual property. This dynamic is evident not only in Europe, but globally, and especially in the global north, and we will hear much more about that, where competition often overshadows collaborations. So countries are increasingly imposing restrictions on research partnerships, and they're even drafting lists of countries with which universities should no longer engage, or to a very little extent. So what are the ethical dimensions and global governance? That's what the speakers will also talk about. The ethical dimensions of the debate are of course crucial. How can universities and governments ensure that international collaboration aligns with democratic values, human rights, and research integrity? While competing, on the one hand, ethical internationalization seeks to ensure that research benefits all, not just the select few. This brings us to the question of global governance. How can we then ensure that global research collaboration remains transparent, fair, and beneficial to all? International frameworks, such as those promoted by UNESCO or the World Health Organization or others, as well as the IAU, offer models for fostering cooperation over competition. And these frameworks ensure accountability and ensure collaboration based on shared values and aiming to mitigate the negative effects of global rivalry. So we have to consider this work against the backdrop of much of the work published by the speakers who we will hear, listen to, and will present alternative perspectives on responsible internationalization and advocate for a redefinition of the concept focused much more on balance, responsibility, sustainability, inclusion, and balance and compliance, I suspect they will argue that universities should intentionally choose their international partnerships based on geographical, economic, and linguistic open balance, and commit to long-term sustainability and inclusivity. Such perspectives will emphasize cooperation over competition and fosters internationalization that benefits everyone involved. So in conclusion, responsible internationalization should not be only about balancing cooperation and competition, but about navigating these two forces in a way that will foster innovation, equity, and sustainability. So we must balance the need for technological leadership with our responsibility to foster global partnerships that address humanity's most pressing challenges. So over to the speakers. I think there is a lot that we can learn from this very particular webinar today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those reflections. And now we invite Hans to add to these ideas about the challenge of defining responsible internationalization. Thank you very much. Hans.
Thank you, Gerardo, and thank you, Hilligje, for your introducing remarks. Always difficult to follow up to you. But this webinar basically came from a discussion that Hilligje and I had together with Giorgio Marinoni a few months ago in Paris, where we noticed that suddenly there was a new terminology developing into higher education about the responsible internationalization, which we had a completely different idea about and what we saw that was in the debate. So this is a very important topic. I think it goes to the essence of what we have as higher education and its international dimensions. Cooperation has been always the driving force of internationalization in our higher education community. And we always use terms like knowledge diplomacy, the term that in particular my colleague and friend Jay Knight has been developed, knowledge as being a very important dimension to collaborate, to break barriers between different countries, but different political environments, etc. That was very much at the core of what internationalization was. The same is what Hilligje referred to. Cooperation was driving the agenda in international dimensions of higher education and shifted then to a much more competitive environment, but still holding to the idea that we had to be much more cooperative. And then we had this role as higher education that we were responsible for societal needs at the local context, but also in the global context. And what we have seen in a very short period of time, that knowledge diplomacy has become knowledge security, cooperation has become competition, and socially responsibility for our global society has become political responsibility for our nation, for our own security as nationalist organizations. And that trend we see very rapidly developing in the world. And it goes to the essence of what we mean with higher education and its internationalization, which should be still focused on as much as possible. We need to focus on cooperation. I don't deny the fact that cooperation and higher education can be misused. So that we have also a responsibility in that sense to be careful that there is no misuse of higher education and collaboration in that sense. That's a very important part, and that we always have tried to do and continue to do in our higher education community. But now it becomes much more a kind of political agenda from national governments in Europe, unfortunately also by the European Commission, that is saying, well, we should not be as necessarily open, we should be necessarily closed, and where it's possible, we can collaborate. And I think that is a very dangerous development. It goes against our really existence as higher education community and of the way we have been internationally collaborating. And it's a very important topic. And clearly the fact also that we have so many participants in this webinar, much more than the previous ones that we have been organizing, is that also you as participants think this is a very important debate. It's not an easy debate, because as I said, there is a need also to be careful about misuse of higher education collaboration. So we have to find ways how to deal with that. But that should not be at the cost of the fact that we should not strive as much as possible as higher education community to collaborate in teaching, to collaborate in research, and to collaborate in our service to our society. That's why it was so important, and Luciane, who will speak here in the panel, developed the notion of responsible internationalization from a very social point of view. It's also illustrating that it comes from somebody from what we call the Global South, that for them it's very important that their research is considered as important, as equally important as the research that we do and the teaching that we do in the Global North. That there should be a responsibility in the way we collaborate, North-South, South-North, South-South, in the way we collaborate, to be it in a very socially responsible way. And so the fact that we see now, in particular in the Global North, a tendency to close ourselves up from international collaboration, that's a very dangerous development, because it stimulates inequality and not equity. As also Hilligje said, it makes it necessary for the Global South much more to take on their own responsibilities to collaborate, and we from the Global North, in our arrogant way of dominance, ignore the fact that we have to collaborate in sense. So it is important to look as a higher education community, how can we fight against this trend to be much closed as possible, and how we can create much more openness in our collaboration, of course securing still our responsible way how to do that. I think that's the essence of the debate. That's also the essence of the way Chris Klaas and I, in our article for International Higher Education and University World News, have been addressing the issue. We should be really, as higher education community, discuss this, find ways how to fight against closing up, and find ways how we can continue to be open as much as possible in our international collaboration in the North, in the South, and together, all at once. And with that, I think I keep it short, because I think we have such great panelists to make that discussion further going on. I look very much forward to it as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hans. Thank you very much, both Hans and Hilligje, for joining us and for sharing this framing of the session, which I really think it advances the purposes of the next stage. So I will now would like to turn it over to Giorgio to then also moderate the panel that we will have. So we will be welcoming our colleagues. But Giorgio, please, if you would like to take over next.
Yes, thank you very much, Gerardo. Thank you very much to Hans and Hilligje for framing so nicely the topic of today's discussion. I'm very pleased to have distinguished panelists to present and discuss this topic. And the panel will work in this way. Each of the panelists will have initial remarks that will be introduced from a question that I will pose them, and then we will start with a discussion. And for this reason, I also invite, as Gerardo has done already at the beginning, all the participants to pose their questions in the chat, because after the presentation of the panelists, the debate will be open not only between the panelists, but also with you participants. My first question will be for Luciane. As Hans has already said, Luciane, around 5 years ago, you introduced academically the concept of responsible internationalization in a series of articles. Can you please elaborate and tell us a little bit more about this concept and how you frame it, how you create this kind of concept and you put it, and how also, if you can, also how do you see if this concept is evolving right now?
Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank you very much for this invitation and for this beautiful opportunity to be here with such a selected speakers and selected audience. It's a great opportunity for us. And to complement for this initiative of discussing this topic of responsible internationalization. As you mentioned, Giorgio, about 5 years ago, I remember I sent an article to Hans, and he said it has a great potential. And I felt encouraged to publish this, and I published also in the University World News, because just to give you an idea, I come from Brazil, South America, Latin America. In Latin America, we have 20 countries, 9% of the world population. We are close about 700 million people, and the difficulty in accessing the higher education system, growing population. We do speak Spanish and Portuguese. The ideal of numbers in international mobility in 2019, we are close to 2.3 million, expecting to get to 8 million in 2025. This represents 2.6% of the whole population. Just considering Brazilian universities, we have almost to 10 million students, and Brazilian universities will never get to close to 1% in student mobility. So all these numbers made me feel a little bit a part of this internationalization scenario. And I thought that we should think about in a more critical way. And that's why exactly I decided to publish. And by coincidence, I created the responsible internationalization scenario based on 5 pillars. The first one, and it created the word basic, B-A-S-I-C. The first one was exactly because I was looking at the different possibilities, different opportunities that student had. The B represents balance, equilibrium. So we should look, when you talk about internationalization, that internationalization should be considering linguistic aspects, economic aspects, geographical aspects. When we sign agreements, most of Latin American institutions, we have a huge number of European and North American agreement terms, and we don't look back to having this Latin American agreement terms as with the same strength. So when I talk about balance, means exactly to look in a more equitable way, considering knowledge areas that we should consider everyone possible to have an international experience. Talking about the A, BA from the basic, comes from the accountability, the social responsibility that we have when we talk about internationalization. We bring international speakers, we have international researchers in our institution, but we almost do not invite the society to come, to join, to use all this beautiful potential. So when we talk about accountability, means engage everyone in the impacts of the internationalization. How can we manage to have more people using the benefits of internationalization, international knowledge, international possibilities? How can we tell the society what we do with internationalization numbers, that we do have students from all over the place, we have international speakers, we have researchers. What about the impact of our research? It means that we must look for more social responsibility, look for the impacts, measure the impacts, and tell the society what we are doing with internationalization results. The S comes from sustainability. We remember, and I think all of you remember, when you have the Science Without Borders program, the Brazil initiative, that it was fantastic. As soon as we ended the program, and I'm sorry, I'm going to be very honest, as soon as the money ended, we tried to keep the cooperation, but most of universities told us, well, no money, no cooperation, which means it was not a collaborative possibility. We were just paying for enrollments, we were just paying for international mobility. And then I thought, well, my goodness, who pays the bill? Sustainability means that we must look for financial sustainability, economic sustainability, environmental sustainability, cultural, social, and think about how can we maintain internationalization activities, looking for this sustainable. So it's much more collaborative, much more responsible, much more social and cultural, thinking about individual gains, but for the social gains as well, for the collective gains. Inclusion comes from the I, from the basic. Inclusion must not represent exclusion. Giorgio, when I have African students here in Brazil, and I'm in Florianopolis, and you know about program of internationalization with African students, we have more than 1,000 African students here at this institution. And it hurts me when one African student tells me, Dr. Stallivieri, I spent 4 years in Brazil, but I have no Brazilian friends. I just have African friends, which means that we are opening the doors of our institutions. We are receiving international students, but we are working much more in exclusive way than in excluding the students more than including them, integrating them in our academic activities. So it means that we must look for, in a very responsible way, what are we doing? Do we have policies to engage, to make the students feel really part of our communities, or we are just exactly opening the doors, giving them a number in our institutions? And the last one means the compliance. Basic means the compliance, the C, which is exactly, are we looking for the regulations, the law, everything that implies when we open your institutions, bring international students, when we do international research, are we observing the ethical, the critical aspects, the sustainability, the inclusion, thinking about how can we promote knowledge diplomacy, how can we promote the diplomacy when we think about, are we really sharing, are we really collaborating, or we are just getting the knowledge produced and kind of empowering ourselves with this knowledge. So it's a very controversial, and I'm very glad that from my point of view in 2018, this topic, responsible internationalization, has been growing, and it's been provoking us to have this beautiful reflection today with almost 300 participants from all over the world, because internationalization has a personality, it has life by itself, and it's growing. And of course, we must keep this thinking of turning inequalities in equity, exclusion into inclusion, the economic aspect in more sustainable one, and this unbalance in a more balance, because I really believe internationalization must be for everyone, not for the ones who can speak a language, who have the money or a familiar background that stimulates to do an international activity. And we are the ones who are responsible for this responsible internationalization. Thank you, Giorgio. Give back to you.
Thank you very much, Luciane, and thank you very much for, in a way, bringing us back to the basic. Let me allow me this joke with your the acronym that you clearly stated, how responsible internationalization and the values it is based upon. I would like now to introduce to the panel Tommy Shih. Tommy, you recently wrote a very interesting article analyzing the vision that the European Union had of responsible internationalization, and this understanding of responsible internationalization is quite different from the one that we just heard from Luciane. Can you please introduce this concept, but also have a little bit of reflection of how this concept is understood by higher education institutions in Europe, how it is received and how it is interpreted? Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Giorgio, and thank you for inviting me to talk about these issues. I would just like to start with saying that in answering this question, of course, I'll do simplify quite a lot, and the interpretation that I'm making might not be the one of the European Commission, of course. But let me start with just saying that there are many different views of what this is in Europe, so it will also vary within the Commission, of course, but also between universities and member states. I will not go too much into depth about what the European Union is thinking about this, because Hilligje was talking about this as well. But I would just like to say that international or responsible internationalization has not really been promoted by the European Commission. I mean, it has been mentioned, and it was one of the themes that was driven by Sweden during its presidency of the Council of the European Union in 2023. So I think it kind of stuck around because of that. And in the proposal for enhancing research security in the end of 2023 and beginning of 24, then there were principles for responsible internationalization, and that included, as he was saying, also and Hans also alluded to the as open as necessary, and as open as possible and as close as necessary, right? But then when the recommendations came out in May 2024, then there were no remarks about responsible internationalization. So really what is being used in the European Commission context is really research security. So that's not as broad term as responsible internationalization, but we also have knowledge security. There's also a lot on tackling foreign interference in research and innovation, and also the trusted research term that's been used quite a lot in UK. So what these terms really focus on is this increased geopolitical situation, the increased tensions in the geopolitical landscape, basically. So where we basically are starting to view universities and research as national resources. So basically they become assets of nations. And that's part of the increased nationalism and increased protectionism that we see in the world. And aligned with that, or I think what's coming after that is also what we've seen, more regulations and more legislation, trying to somehow influence that, but also policies and practices around it. So going back then to responsible internationalization, I think that is more a term that is being used by universities and higher education institutions overall, because it is more about institutions gaining a certain level of agency within this environment, which is now becoming increasingly tougher, where we really have less autonomy. The distance between the state and the higher education sector is shrinking. And of course, I believe that is definitely not a good thing, but that is what we're seeing. So responsible internationalization then is a term that I have noticed have been used to try to catch kind of all these different goals you have in internationalization, including excellence, competition, but it's also about inclusivity, about solving global challenges, equity, and also about science diplomacy, and as well as a form of soft power. So those things are kind of like all integrated into this, and they're not really that easy to handle, of course. But so for me, responsible internationalization is, when I use it, it's not so much about these goals. It's not so much basically about the role of universities in society, but it's more about, given that we have these goals, then what are the responsible ways of navigating? Then we know that there will be certain things that will be the issue of compliance. There will be also broader goals of making the resource findings from research available, for example, to disenfranchised groups, etc. But often they conflict with each other. So you can't just be open, and because what we notice in particular fields, scientific fields, there will be a border somewhere where people are starting to say that no, we need to start to protect this, because this might lead to that there are foreign actors that can use it for nefarious purposes, etc. Right? So in a sense, then going back to what I was talking about, responsible internationalization then becomes a term that is used heavily by not only university administrators, but also to a certain extent by researchers, to say that, well, we know that it is very tricky, but we're doing something. And we need to focus on the responsibilities of what we do when we internationalize. But with that said, and then coming down to the implementation, the other question. So what does that really mean then? Because what does it mean that we need to be responsible? I mean, one part of it would be to adhere to rules and regulation. That could be related to export controls. It could be about protective security, information security, and those kind of things. But it's also about all these things that people are doing with a lot of freedom, because most things does not need to be regulated. And actually, there is a lot of exchanges and collaborations that are ongoing, and where researchers and higher education institutions and teachers have a lot of autonomy in doing what they feel are worth their time, and also that are helping to develop different solutions for global challenges and those kind of things, right? And it's really there where responsibility needs to be, I would say, emphasized, because here you usually don't have a lot of clear guidelines for what is responsible. For example, if we would share something with someone else, or if we bring in students from other places, what would actually be a good way to share this so that people can take part of the research or the exchange between teachers, at the same time, not getting too close to those things where all of a sudden there will be some compliance officer telling us that no, you're doing something that we don't like. So it's really about putting kind of the emphasis there. And this means also addressing and emphasizing that actually internationalization is something very complicated. It is a portfolio of many, many different goals that need to kind of align with each other, but often they do not. So they create conflicts. And how do you manage that type of goal conflict? So it's really about navigation. It's really about navigating now, and especially now when the situation in the world is becoming increasingly tougher. So that's, I think, my explanation of how we view responsible internationalization. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tommy, for this clear explanation on how your university, and actually I think it's nice that you put the emphasis on how the universities are interpreting the term, and it's not just imposed from political actors, but how they are trying to construct a narrative about this term, especially in Europe nowadays. Now I would like to move from Europe to another region of the world, and I would like to move to Africa, to move to Aisha. And to Aisha, I would like to pose the following question. We heard it also in the initial remarks of Hans. Is it an impression that this debate on especially the second part of the concept of the understanding of responsible internationalization, when it's much more related to national security, research security, is this something related to the Western world? Is this something related to North America and Europe, or is it something also of actuality? Is there a debate also in Africa about this concept? And if this is the case, what is the African understanding and the African interpretation of responsible internationalization?
Thank you so much, Giorgio. It's good to be here with you all. Yes, there is a growing debate in Africa about the concept of responsible internationalization in higher education. However, I think I would like us to, the universities here initially, because of like the colonial background, I think that played a big role here. So people were not willing to, like have internationalization with foreign universities at the beginning because they felt it was hampering on their independence. But then gradually they realized that it was something that they needed. And so they started reaching out. So now it's like we're sort of caught in between. We need to reach out for visibility and other things, but then at the same time, we're trying to not lose our independence. So yes, the lenses I would say that Africa is looking at this through would be to avoid dependency, so have collaborations that build capacity and support for local contests rather than, the unequal dynamics of the North-South divide. And we are also really concentrating on local needs. So by addressing societal challenges and fostering sustainable development. Another thing is we're very much interested in the ethical practices. We want equitable mobility schemes. So what happens is you see our students here from Africa moving to Europe or North America. And like the first speaker said, someone said to her, one of her students, that they've been in Brazil for 4 years, but they don't have any Brazilian friend. So we find a situation whereby we sponsor our students and our staff to go there, and they come back with really nothing much added to the university. Rather, what happens is sometimes, in fact, 80% of the time, you see the students or the staff remain there. So it's like it has become a sort of money drain for us. And the problem that my university in particular faces with this is because it's a federal university, so it's financed by the federal government. So when we sponsor such staff, it's from a federal government grant. And so now we have an agency that does that. It's called the TED Fund, the Tertiary Education Trust Fund. And they've just written to us saying that they are no longer sponsoring international education anymore. So it's like, it's a big blow for us. But part of the problem is because, like I said, people don't come back. And so we don't really benefit from it as such. We're trying to see how we can do that in a way that is balanced, but it's really difficult, especially because, I'll give an example. We have we had the British Council Going Global Conference here in November, and my university had a stand there, and the people that came were so surprised and shocked. Oh, they didn't know we're doing this type of research, or that we had this, and they're like, oh, you need to showcase your university more so that people will know about it. But it's like, when we do the research, you're encouraged to publish locally, to publish home, and then it doesn't increase your visibility because they do not have the DOI and other stuff like that. So it's like you're still struggling to catch up. So for us, internationalization is something that we really want to do, but it's a bit difficult because we don't feel like we're on an equal footing. And then also there's the issue of cultural sensitivity. So what we're trying to do is to promote indigenous knowledge as well and languages. Yesterday, I was reading in the news that a governor of one of the states in Nigeria, so English is the lingua franca, it's the common language here. But a governor in one of the states, we have 36 states, and the FCT was saying that the local language should now be used in teaching. And, it garnered a lot of reactions, but that's the norm in, for example, Russia or in India or in China, and I think research has shown that you need your local language. When you're talking your local language, you tend to understand better rather than in English. So we have that problem. We're still struggling. And like I said, it's because of our historical background with the colonialization and, other issues, trying to come to live that and then, grow from that and like get a sort of rebirth. So it's a very difficult thing for us right now. We're just trying to find our bearings. And also you find that when we try to do internationalization here in Africa, we usually just focus on Europe or North or South America, but not the continent itself, which isn't good for us. And even when we send our people, to go there and study, so they study, for example, if you study agriculture in England, the weather conditions are very different from that here. So how do you apply that knowledge here? So for us, it's like we're trying to find a balance, but it's really very difficult to do so. And so we're trying to see, how the North or, our partners can help out. And that's why when we have programs now, when we try to go into MOUs with our international partners, we usually try to focus on things that can actually, help us, that will address our own challenges rather than just general stuff, things affecting the other side. So I think for us, that's just what I want to say. It's a very dicey and tricky situation for us, internationalization. We realize its benefits and we want to benefit from it, but it's difficult. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aisha, for framing and contextualizing the debate on responsible internationalization in Africa on a, I would say, broader debate in Africa on internationalization itself, on what does it mean and how to also relate it with the process of Africanization that you mentioned in your discourse. Let me now go to the last but not least speaker of the panel, Chris. And to Chris, I would like to ask the following question. First of all, Chris, is responsible internationalization a term used and understood in North America and especially in the US context, or are some of the topics that we heard from other speakers existing and discussed, but maybe with different names? So can you please elaborate a little bit on the general debate on responsible internationalization from, let's say, the semantic point of view, but also from the content point of view?
All right, thank you, Giorgio. Well, in many ways, the U.S. is a market-driven kind of system, and so it has a marketplace of terms it might use for internationalization. It could be everything from comprehensive internationalization, critical internationalization, intelligent internationalization. But among this kind of marketplace of terms, I would say there's very much an ethos, at least politically, of a responsible internationalization. So while we might not use the language of Europe and Australia related to responsible internationalization, we certainly have it pervading the kind of ethos in American society. I mean, just like animal spirits drive the markets, nationalist spirits are currently driving the conversations around internationalization in the U.S. And this really is regardless of political party or who might be president of the United States. I mean, in part, this is interesting because of the way the U.S. has this distributed kind of market-like network of requirements that flow through multiple agencies. And it's part of what creates the core tension as we think about openness on one hand and security on the other, to echo the European Commission's kind of language of as open as possible, as closed as necessary. But the core tension of the U.S. system is we don't have a centralized coordinating body like Europe and Australia. So it's kind of retrofitting security controls onto this decentralized system. I like to compare this to the big dig that happened in Boston. For those who may not be familiar, this is a sprawling infrastructure project that took 30 years of building underground tunnels and rerouted highways. And it took 3 decades, and it came as a massive, expensive, and kind of unavoidable enterprise. But it changed the traffic patterns around Boston. In many ways, right now, research security in the US is undergoing its own kind of big dig, and it's going to be transformative. To be able to tell you about this, let me share a story that's not about higher education, but I think you'll see the connection when I reach my conclusion. In the final days of the Biden administration, last week actually, the Biden administration released its national security directive related to something called the AI Diffusion Network, related to chip export. In that diffusion network memorandum, a 168-page document, I call this "Keep Your Allies Close and Your Friends Verified," because it identified 3 tiers of U.S. partners. Trusted partners are traditional allies like UK, Japan, and Germany. Then verified partners, countries like Brazil and Singapore, but also close friends of the US, Israel and India. And then restricted entities, of course, China and Russia. This policy had polarized reactions, not from US universities, but from big tech. OpenAI at the same day released its AI blueprint and called for something very similar, that the US should build an AI compact with its allies. But NVIDIA and Orica took a different stance. They said, this is misguided. This is going to squander America's technological eggs. This is going to put global progress in jeopardy. This is going to go down as one of the most destructive ever in history. These are direct quotes. These sound like proclamations of university presidents, but it shows the concerns about innovation with a security-first approach. If you think about the increasingly security-oriented kind of framework used in the US and the calibrated phrase from the European Commission, as open as possible and closed as necessary, you think at first that sounds pretty reasonable, till you realize that in the US, because so much compliance pressure is put on universities, it's essentially asking universities to continuously find the sweet spot between 2 moving targets: geopolitical alliances, new domestic legislation, reciprocal projects abroad. So universities are already pricing this in the international partnerships that they're forming. Karen Fisher has an interesting piece about the ways in which Congress is using letters of inquiry and driving policy at universities, not through new legislation, but by simply asking questions and shedding spotlights. This has made U.S. universities very risk averse in ways that are really narrowing their research partnerships to things that are more safe and more predictable. The other thing to recognize is that this comes from a zeitgeist of U.S. politics. After China joins the WTO, policymakers place this bet that the economics of globalization would democratize the countries in which we are engaging with free trade, and also it would lead to a kind of a more stable geopolitical order. Anything besides that happened. There was economic fallout in the US. There was a separation between the benefits in the manufacturing economy of those in our manufacturing economy and those benefiting from our global GDP. Manufacturing jobs vanished, labor power declined, and there was rising inequality. So all the gains of economic globalization turned out to be asymmetrical, and it kind of created this shift. I would say there's a similar shift in thinking about open science from the US point of view. In response, America's idea of responsible internationalization now kind of thinks about science as kind of an asset or a lever. It deliberately amplifies collaboration with trusted allies, but also tries to more intentionally exclude adversarial or hostile states from accessing cutting-edge US technology and research. This raises all kinds of questions that I know Hans and I explored in our editorial, both in University World News and International Higher Education. And lots of questions that universities here are going to have to grapple with. Questions about governance, innovation, and the distribution of knowledge. And I frame these three questions very simply and shortly. Who decides? What gets lost? And then who gets left behind in this new order? From a governance perspective, the question is who decides? The line between open and closed, it's increasingly be driven by top-down policymakers, not research and technologists that are advancing science. This is an unprecedented shift in the way that we're structuring American research, security, and global science. On innovation, the question is what gets lost? The fragmented research ecosystem that could result from this kind of allied-based approach could really stifle the serendipitous collaborations and the network effects that are happening, especially around critical fields like climate science, where global collaboration is critical for progress. Markets and everything, including ideas, work best when barriers to entry are low and information flows freely. And finally, distribution. Who gets left behind? Essentially, what we see in the AI diffusion network is kind of likely what we're going to see in our internationalization strategies in the US, a multi-tiered system, or at least a dual-tiered system, and increasing intelligence divides that happen that are going to be far more consequential than things that we talked about when we used the term digital divides in the past. So I really think we're entering, in some ways, a natural experiment. The US has this very decentralized system that's looking to try to balance openness with security without stifling progress. And other countries have a more coordinated and centralized system. And what I'd highlight is similar to Boston's Big Dig, it's going to come at a tremendous cost. It's going to have countless unexpected complications along the way. And it's possible that the cost could exceed all estimates that we make today. I'm going to link to a full thought piece in the chat.
Thank you very much, Chris, also for using these metaphors that help us visualizing what the debate is about and how it could evolve from now on. And I would say, like, at the end, you close with we can expect the unexpected. And the only thing that we are sure today is that there is something evolving, and it's probably evolving also quite fast. I would like to give back the floor to Gerardo, because I know he was monitoring the questions in the chat and he spotted some interesting questions from you participants. So I will invite Gerardo to pose the first question to our panelists.
Thank you very much, Giorgio, for doing this very complicated job of balancing all of our different contributions. Thank you to all the panelists, of course, for being so mindful of time and keeping us very much on time and allowing us to have time to engage robustly with the different questions. So I'm really bringing in a couple of different questions here. So credit goes to our colleague Anne Zimmerman, who presented a couple of questions about these. So we are, of course, dealing with complex concepts, and the question really engages with a few other ideas. So first of all, the question for all of our panelists, feel free to address any one of you, or perhaps all of you on this part, is how important do you think the focus that we are having should be about clear definitions, right? So for example, part of the question had to do, is there a difference between, for example, knowledge diplomacy and science diplomacy? Are these two concepts similar enough, or are they very different? Also, the other question had to do of how does responsible internationalization relate to the knowledge commons, which is an idea that Eleanor Ostrom has posed. So in other words, should our focus as an academic community be on agreeing and building consensus on these clear definitions, or should it be much more about the practice, right? And how these ideas and concepts are translated and implemented? I really would look forward to your comments on this question. And similarly, like, should all just agree with one definition of responsible internationalization, or rather agree on a series of principles that then we uphold? Could we perhaps start with Luciane? Yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Anne Zimmerman, for your comments. And again, this is a very, very intriguing topic. And as long as we progress with this beautiful webinar, of course, we are having lots of insights. First of all, what I understand by scientific and knowledge diplomacy, I think both of them, they look for answers for global problems. So the idea is exactly, we are here to look for knowledge diplomacy and looking for this political aspect, as Tommy mentioned. How can we look for answers to global issues? How can you progress and use the internationalization knowledge produced among different universities? The idea of having just one definition, I don't think this is very of course, it is relevant to have one basic definition, but exactly as internationalization, for example, we cannot apply the same concept to different countries, to different institutions, considering that we have different political aspects in each country, different economical issues, different cultural aspects, the size of an institution, the vocation of the institution. So I understand there must be a very important definition, but the most important thing are the principles that you can follow on those definitions. You cannot apply the same measures of evaluation, for example, the theory of one size fits all. It doesn't fit all. We all know that. For example, we use the metrics to evaluate the internationalization. We must consider so many different aspects for that. And that's why rankings are so polemical, are so complex. Most people love them, some people hate them. What I understand for this new internationalization concept or defining responsible internationalization, I would go to the definition of transforming internationalization. Internationalization, and we can add, Gerardo, so many adjectives: intelligent, responsible, disruptive, as I wrote it about some years ago, hybrid internationalization. What I think is internationalization, it's a changing mindset in our institutions. Recently, my friend Carla Casol and I spent a week in UTPR in Ecuador, doing a completely changing mindset, because it's not a department, it's a behavior. The whole institution must breathe internationalization. Everyone must be engaged with internationalization. When you talk about, and I think someone sent a question about how can we work with belonging. Of course, if you have a welcome policy to help researchers, professors, and students to feel that on that time, 6 months they stay in your university, they will belong to that culture. So cross-cultural studies, intercultural competences, everything must be related to this behavior of internationalization. It's not a department. It's a changing mindset, understanding, and the most important thing for me, it must be based on values. Ethic, respect, reciprocity, horizontal relationship, respect the others. It's not just giving or taking. Everyone has something to share. Everyone has something beautiful. English, of course, it's a tool for us, but I would love to see 258 official languages that we have in Brazil valued, not only Portuguese. And how can we have linguistic policies in order to promote other languages in the world? So again, it's transformative, it's more like a behavior, it's a changing mindset, must be engaging everyone. And again, we have to look, Gerardo and Giorgio, for the forced internationalization. We have lots of migrants coming to our institutions. How can we engage them? How can we welcome them? How can we receive people from Ukraine, I noticed that the World News mentioned 90,000 students from Gaza are out of higher education institutions. It is our responsibility to look at that. How can we open the doors? And again, thinking in a way that is very responsible, very committed. Thank you, Gerardo. Gerardo, sorry.
Luciane. Tommy or Chris, would you like to comment on this notion of balancing principles and definitions, perhaps?
Yeah,
Tommy, go ahead. Yeah.
Go ahead. And yeah, I think it's incredibly difficult because it's like I said before, there are different prefixes that we can put before internationalization, and I don't really I don't really kind of see how it will help to have one definition here, because there's so many different views of what it is. And on the one hand, I think that we can talk about the normative aspects of internationalization, the role of universities in society, which I think is extremely important. And that discussion definitely needs to be had. I've been from my work, how I've been using responsible internationalization is more to raise awareness and actually kind of try to put the finger on that something needs to be done in this situation. I mean, and I specifically focused on involuntarily on securitization, for example. Like we know that some of the things that Chris just mentioned about the kind of different tracks, like TSA, where you can have like almost this rapid lane where people can just go through, and then you will have others that will. So there are these systems in place today in many countries, not only in the US, but also starting to see those in Europe. And these and science today and research, higher education, it is asymmetrical. So it's those that are, I would say, more research endowed and have better brands that kind of will be able to set the conditions for how exchange will look like, also internationally. And now so many of these countries kind of focus on securitization. So I have, like I said, involuntarily had to kind of direct some of the attention towards that, so that you always kind of tend to be that even if we talk about how higher education should be inclusive, it should be equitable, those kind of things, it always kind of stops because there's something more urgent matter, which is often about how do we protect what we have. So for me, responsible internationalization is a way to kind of address, something that needs to be taken in as a whole, not only about either the securitization part of it, but also the solving global challenges. Like why should we just do it to be able to build our own economic systems and those kind of questions, So for that matter, yeah, go ahead, Chris.
I thought you were done. Sorry.
Yeah. So in that sense, I think that responsible internationalization is extremely valuable term to use to kind of set that direction. But at the same time, we know that because of it not being defined clearly enough, it will be used and it will be abused.
And I briefly add, I think context is really important here. And there's two things that I think that are driving it that we probably haven't emphasized enough. One is the rapid advancement of really high sensitive technologies that are going to lead to both kind of military and economic advantages. And then second, the ways in which some of the large geopolitical actors are kind of reinterpreting their own economic policies related to these technological advancements, but also trying to address the kind of massive stratification, social stratification that happened in the period of hyperglobalization that happened between 2000 and 2020. So it's kind of these economic impulses that creates this political environment. But I want to highlight very briefly, similar to an argument that Hans de Wit made in a recent piece in the Journal for Studies of Internationalization, where he says, we call everything that quacks internationalization. We're going to have to get really good at defining what we mean by internationalization. And I'm not talking about a definition of terms, but a kind of a reinterpretation, not of definitions, but of directions. So I think what is striking, especially with Tommy's Shih's research about responsible internationalization, is not that it's just the latest definition. We've seen a progression of definitions, but it is a remarkably new direction. It's a critical disjuncture from the past. And it's a way of negotiating this openness versus security debate. This is something that has always existed since the post-Cold War, since we were developing rocket, nuclear, and other kinds of technologies as well. but it's taken a different shift in a multipolar world with shifting alliances related to that. And I think that's where the key questions I highlight. If it's about directions and not definitions, then it's about politics. Politics is about a few things. Who participates in that decision? Is this a top-down directive by policymakers that are disconnected from global science? Or are scientists and university leaders involved in the politics of that? Politics are also about distribution. Who gets the benefit? Who's a part of being a part of the decision process? Then who gets the benefit of the kind of structural arrangements that are created? And that's why institutions are going to have to be careful, not thinking about just the definition of this, but what directions might be their university might be taken, and then the kind of the second and third order effects of what this might mean for global science.
Here, I would like to thank our panelists. I also acknowledge that very sadly, Aisha has dropped from the call. There might be some issue with connection, and we will hope that she'll rejoin us. That is the only reason why she's not also weighing in on these significant questions. I wanted to be clear that it's a technical issue and not a decision on our part as facilitators. We hope she'll be able to rejoin us. But because, as it has been mentioned, we're dealing with definitions and with concepts. I know that Hans wanted to contribute to this question as well. So Hans, if you'd like to also share your perspective, feel free to do so.
Yeah, thank you. I think all three panelists have said very important things. Luciane said about the importance of context, which is very essential. The topic of principles has been mentioned. And I think Tommy said in particular, terms are not so much important, it's directions where we go to and what is happening in different directions, understanding that. So I had a debate several years ago when John Hussack created the term comprehensive internationalization, said, well, internationalization is comprehensive, but it's not internationalization. You can to a certain extent say the same about responsible internationalization. Internationalization can only be internationalization when it is responsible. But what happens here is that people and labels are important to understand what are the principles you are driving. So what are you wanting to emphasize when you're talking about internationalization? So forced internationalization, Luciane says, is addressing the importance of dealing with migrants and refugees. Comprehensive internationalization deals with the fact that it should not be something isolated to the international office, but to all the stakeholders in the higher education institution, and so on and so on. But responsible internationalization now is used in two different ways. One is the one that Luciane emphasized, emphasizing the social responsibility, and where Tommy describes, because I don't think he adheres to that, but he describes correctly, and he does very important and relevant research on that, that it can be used as a way of closing collaboration because national security issues. So that makes it very important that we always have to address what do we mean when we use certain terminology, what when we mean when we use certain labels, to be very clear explicitly what we do. And we sometimes indeed forget that, and that's why Chris correctly referred to my article about everything that quexes internationalization, and by that internationalization doesn't mean anything. We have to be very careful, what are we talking about, and what are the opportunities and what are the challenges with certain directions that are taking place.
Thank you very much to all of our participants. Hilligje, would you like to also weigh in? Please come in.
Yes, I think it's important to, since Aisha, she wrote to me that indeed she doesn't manage to get back into the webinar. She's been trying a few times, but there is a technical issue. She had unstable internet. So right there, internationalization is an issue. If you cannot take part even in a webinar like this one, it's already problematic because then you cannot influence the discourse and the discussion itself. And this to be said, she's just been appointed Vice Chancellor of the University of Abuja, and she really wants to work on internationalization with all of you to actually make a difference in Nigeria in particular, but in the sub-region as well, and more broadly speaking. I think two of the issues that she broached, which are are very important for the conversation as well, is something that Luciane, Hans, and Chris, Tommy, you all also talked about, and that's this dependency issue. So she's also saying that actually the university is not autonomous and doesn't have the academic freedom to decide on what internationalization really means to them. They're dependent on funding that's now being stopped for internationalization because the government sees that people go abroad, never come back. So the public sector has paid for the basic education, and then people leave either at master level or doctorate for actually never to return. And that's, they try to mitigate that by cutting the finances and the opportunities for people to go abroad. That's probably also not responsible. So there are other ways to be looked at in order to make this dependency issue to be looked at correctly. Also this balancing act, which she uses in a different way than Luciane does. And she also talked about the fact that universities in Africa, in her part of the African continent, are not coming in on equal footing. So there, right there, we're not actually probably implementing what we preach for, responsible internationalization to the full, because the partners we work with in Africa often feel that they are not part of the conversation on equal footing. So maybe something interesting for the speakers to get back to. Then there was this language of languages. I think you noted as well, something that we see in many other platforms as well. What do we do about the language issue? Luciane, you mentioned the fact that in Brazil, the lingua franca, to misname it, has become English, but still there are many different other languages spoken on the Latin or South American continent, and what to do about that when it comes to international opportunities, when it comes to... So these points, I would not like them to slide off the radar. Maybe that the speakers can say a few things about it, because they were very important in the coming into the conversation of Aisha, where she looked at this responsibility when it comes to internationalization from a perspective of what does this mean for the African continent, for a country like Nigeria, and for the University of Abuja in particular. So maybe there's something there to be said as well. So I don't know who would like to say something about it. Maybe Luciane?
Okay. Since I started, I'll keep the first one. Well, what I understand, and having insights from this conversation, and thank you very much for this beautiful opportunity. I still think that context defines internationalization. Of course, as Hans just mentioned, we do have a beautiful definition. This definition has been improving and growing. I understand that internationalization, it's on his, it's not a teenager anymore, it's an adult. And as an adult, it has all the beauty and all the problems as well. I'm thinking about the last 25 years, okay? So we've been discussing internationalization deeply and hardly, and trying to understand and adding more concepts, adding more elements for this. But exactly, where are you? What are your conditions? What do you have in your institution? When you talk about American institutions, of course, as Chris mentioned very well, we have a different context, different funding, different language, different position. If you talk about Nigerian institutions, of course, the context is really different. So what is the starting point? Where do you talk from? What are your conditions to develop? Even in Brazil, we have, for example, universities concentrated in São Paulo and Rio, which are high level, very well evaluated, considering to the north, to the border. We are trying to analyze the basic education internationalization now, thinking that young kids need to be with the same conditions to internationalize, thinking the school is the beginning of this internationalization. And when you talk about that, let's bring in the linguistic policy. We have indigenous languages, we have border languages, we have binational schools, we have border schools, and they do not consider themselves internationalized. Even if they cross the street and they speak Spanish, and they come back and they speak Portuguese. So how can we manage to discuss these principles of internationalization with very young kids? how to develop on them this intercultural understanding that we do not have a culture that is better than the other. You must respect, you must understand the differences, you must develop this concept of understanding the world, education for peace, global education, global citizenship, planetary consciousness. So there are so many elements, so many values, so many things that we must start developing in very young kids. By the time they come to the university, they already have the sense of internationalization. So I understand that, Hilligje, both definitions can be used. Both definitions are very important. We have one that comes for dependency, autonomy, as Tommy mentioned, closing collaboration, security issues, and I'm kind of defending responsible internationalization. What counts for me is how can you use internationalization to better solve local problems? How can you use internationalization, understanding global solutions? How can I bring them to my local community? The idea is exactly internationalization is a mean for quality, not learning for inputs and outputs. Let's look for learning outcomes. What are the results of international research? What are the results of international mobility? What are the results of international collaboration? And I want to be very ideally or being a dreamer, but I really do dream with education for peace. Someone is mentioning, what about the SDGs? They're talking about digital inequality. So we have so many problems to solve in my house, in my garden. How can I look to you? How can I look to your solutions and bring them back? And especially talking about linguistic issues, we must develop why English is so strong. Why is it the lingua franca? And I'm going to make kind of a share on me, on my country. What about the Portuguese language policy? How can we promote the Portuguese all over the world, considering that Brazil is number one partner with Chinese, number two partner with the United States? So language must be something very respected, but English has a very strong political issue to send English language. I don't think we are very good in sending and selling the Portuguese language. Who do we speak to? Portugal, Cabo Verde, Angola, Mozambique, Timor-Leste, São Tomé e Príncipe. So we have 12 countries. We are more than 300 million Portuguese speakers, but Portuguese is not a very economical important language. How can we develop them? How can we show them, listen, we are number one Chinese partnership. We are number two United States partnership. What about the Portuguese conversation? So we still have to do our homework and develop this welcome policy in Brazilian universities. How can we engage international students? The linguistic policy, so lots to do. But I understand we can kind of add or include or analyze both concepts of responsible internationalization, because both are extremely important depending on the context you are talking about. Thank you, Hilligje, for your question.
Yes, context matters. I will give the floor back to you, Gerardo. I see that the time is ticking. We only have 7 minutes left, but it would still be good maybe to have then all of you also react to some of the points that were made today. I see from the many things coming into the chat that this is only a conversation starter for much more to come. But the floor is back to you, Gerardo.
Thank you. And as always, time is our competitor, our fiercest competitor here. But I think we are succeeding in the sense of really initiating a deep and meaningful conversation. So Giorgio and I have been debating in the back, what should we do next? And we, I think, have agreed that perhaps the best way would be to invite a closing round so that all of our panelists first have an opportunity to share a few of the conclusions. We all have been following the questions. I apologize. Of course, it's impossible to get to all of the questions, but Luciane has addressed masterfully multiple questions at once. So why don't we do that and turn it over to our panelists in the order that they participated? So we would then start with Luciane, Tommy, then Chris, and if we have a minute to spare or so, perhaps our colleagues Hilligje and Hans can close us out. So does that sound like a reasonable plan? Very good, Luciane. Please, if you could share brief closing remarks.
I already spoke too much, so just say thank you very much, and I'm ready for the next round. Thanks a lot.
Wonderful. Tommy?
Yes, no, I would like to say thank you as well. Very interesting to listen to all the speakers and the discussions that we've had. And but I'd just like to maybe add that I think that we are more interwoven than ever in the world today. I mean, if you just look for the past 3 decades, how countries and institutions, as well as researchers and teachers, have been collaborating with each other. But at the same time, I think that the world is still maybe more unequal than ever. And what we're seeing also, the trend with internationalization is that we're seeing it going from something being inclusive and a right that everyone should be able to kind of like have, you know, the right to science and those kind of things. It becomes now an instrument for asymmetry. And that is what worries me. And that kind of like one of the things that I do think we kind of need to consider that point. How do we actually deal with that?
Yeah, my final remarks would simply be to quote John Dewey. He famously said, "Democracy has to be born anew in every generation. In education, it is his midwife." My guess is if you're here today, you're part of the old generation of internationalization, and perhaps, hopefully, there's some people who are part of the new generation. But what I would highlight is the idea is internationalization is evolving, and it's important that we empower the new generation to continue to involve those definitions, but also we're mindful of the ways in which our world has changed from the eras of internationalization many of us enter this conversation into, and begin to continue to steer it in directions we think and values that we believe will help it drive towards its purpose.
So we do have perhaps a minute to split between you, Hilligje, and Hans. Please go ahead.
Guys, Hilligje, shall I start so you can close up also as IAU? Yeah, I mean, this is a discussion we have already, as Luciane said, for over 25 years, not 30 years, and it's continuing to be important. It's even more important in the current situation that we are. We can be very optimistic, as Anthony Ogden in this week in University World, he said, international education is blossoming for the future. I think that's an exaggeration on one hand. If we would be too negative about the opportunities, it would be also an exaggeration. What I see, many of the positive initiatives these days are much more coming from the global south, much more coming from Africa, from Latin America, and from parts of Asia and Central Asia than I see from the global north, where we are too much going inward looking, and that's a very big danger. So let's stay optimistic. Let's also look at the challenges, but also the opportunities that internationalization has, and try to focus on keeping the cooperation going as much as we can. Thank you.
Oops, so half a minute left. I agree with what you just said, and also would like to really warmly thank all the speakers, including Aisha, who is no longer with us, for your fantastic insight. Also, thanks to all those who in the chat have put new food for thought, new food for further deeper engagement with many of the different aspects. Maybe one thing that I would like to pick up, because it came up many times, and this was this tension between the local and the global. I'm actually deeply convinced, after 30 years of international collaboration, that the global informs the local and that the local informs the global, and that this is not necessarily a tension that is negative, but that it's by looking at what's happening elsewhere that we better understand what's happening locally. So there is also this dynamic of cross-feeding of new ideas through anything that we do online and face-to-face. And there are many opportunities, and that's where I agree with you, Hans, that there's also so many opportunities that come with internationalization, even if we know that there are new challenges in bringing everybody on board, if there's there's the happy few that can travel, those who cannot. But we're really looking into those dynamics, really making the case for internationalization to be an opportunity for the many to learn about where we stand in the world and how we can contribute to making it a better place. So I think this is a beautiful first webinar for the year in which IAU will celebrate 75 years of higher education cooperation. And we look forward to working with you much more in this very particular way of an opportunity to broaden our horizons together.
Thank you, Hilligje. Thank you, Giorgio. Thank you to our panelists for joining us. Thank you to all of you for joining us. And remember, this video, the recording of this webinar, will be posted very, very shortly on our different YouTube channels, and we will make sure to disseminate. So thank you again for spending part of your day with all of us, and enjoy the rest of your day and your week. Thank you, Giorgio, for being such a strong partner with us. Thank you, and take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Have a nice day.